You're listening to the Weekly Brew.
Joining us now on the Weekly Brew podcast are Mike Meltser and Seth Payne of MaD Radio, which can be found on Sports Radio 610 in Houston during the morning drive from 6 to 10 a.m. Guys, we appreciate you for joining us this week. And before we get started, some recent changes at 610 bumped your show from the midday to the morning drive. How are you two adjusting to the new time slot and the early arrival in the studios?
I'm kind of surprised. I think Mike, who's not a morning person at all, but maybe perhaps because he's an actual radio professional, is handling it a lot better than I am. I'm always up at like 4:30 or 5 a.m. anyway, but there's a big difference between just going through blog posts and trying to read at 5:30 or 6 a.m. and actually formulating a take and talking on air at 6 a.m. So Mike's been a lot better than that. But other than that, I love just having the rest of the day to watch baseball games or do whatever else I want. So that part of it's nice. I'm still adjusting to being lucid at 6 a.m.
Yeah, that's one of the challenging things that I found is that, you know, you start the show no matter what time of year, it's 6 a.m., and you look outside, it's like pitch dark. And by 7, especially nowadays, it's like, you feel like it's a totally different show because it's light outside, it's bright, and you can, like, see all the cars on the road. And so you kind of feel like you're starting the show in the middle of the night. And I guess the tough thing is that, you know, for me, my schedule is basically I'll watch the end of, let's say, an Astros game or the NBA Finals, and then I'll, like, once that game ends, I'll shut it off, I'll go to bed, I'll, like, wait for 10 minutes to go to sleep. And so I wake up, you know, relatively close to showtime. And there's not, like, as much time compared to middays to really fully formulate what you're about to say. So sometimes you go on at 6 and you're like, well, I watched all this stuff, and I know what's going on. But sometimes it takes a little bit longer to kind of like digest your thoughts and feel like, all right, now I really know what I'm going to say.
You know what I noticed too, Mike? I feel bad now because I used to listen to the morning show and they might be talking about a topic and I'd be thinking, Nick, how do you not know that such and such wrote this or somebody said that? And now I realize that, oh, okay, because he got 4 hours of sleep and he had to go to bed right at the end of the show. So now a lot of times in the morning show, you'll have your opinions and you'll give your takes and you'll feel very strongly about something. Then you get off the show and you read a couple of things and you realize, oh wow, I really wish I had known that at 8 a.m. because I completely disagree with everything I just said.
So you two guys came from completely different backgrounds. I mean, Mike, you came from Syracuse, great school, produced a lot of talent in terms of radio communications, and Seth, obviously you spent time with the Texans and Jaguars. I guess if you're, how does it work just pairing up you two as a team? I mean, you guys have great chemistry on the air. What does that process look like in terms from, when you guys started working together a few years ago to what the show has become now, one of the highest rated shows in the city?
Well, Seth can definitely talk about like the how it started, 3 years ago, because when Brad left the show, the previous iteration of the show, MaD Radio, like my previous boss, Gavin and I both felt like Seth was like the obvious guy to hire for the station because he had been on with Josh Innes and Rich Lord, and he had done like a really good job and he was funny, and obviously he played football and the whole thing. I think that with radio, like it's all about time. Like we have, a new show on the station now with In the Loop in the middays, and sometimes I see on social media or text or whatever, people are like, well, I don't like this show, I don't like that show. And I'm like, what people don't realize sometimes, I don't know how TV is, but with radio, people think that we've been doing a show like in some secret lab for, a year, and then it's like unveiled on the air. Not often the case. Like when Seth and I started the show 3 years ago, us working together, I mean, I don't know, I'm not even sure how much radio we've done. I think Seth has filled in maybe like once or twice for Brad previously, and that was about it. And so it takes like 6 months or so to really form the chemistry of what that show is actually going to be.
Yeah, and I had been living in upstate New York, and I'd call into some Houston stations every now and then. John Granato used to call me once a week to go on his show. I think when Sean Pendergast was with him for a good chunk of that time. And John actually really encouraged me to get back into the business. And I was at a point in my life where I was a few years out of the NFL. I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do when I grew up, And John really encouraged me, so I just decided one month that I was going to come down to Houston and meet everybody at all the stations and kind of just take a grand tour and see if there was something or an opportunity for me. who was the program director at the time, and Mark Vandermeer, who was leaving to go full-time with the Texans at the time, really jumped on it and pursued me, and I started out working part-time during that season. And I really, I jumped into it and treated it like I was getting ready for the combine or getting ready to go play in the NFL. And I paid attention, and I listened to the station all the time and kind of used that 2012 season as an audition. So when Brad Davies left the show, Gavin Spittle, by that point, having seen me work part-time during the entire fall, gave me that opportunity to go in with Mike. And Mike and I had done one show together at the Texans luncheon, Mike. And I remember, and I remember this is like every time I did a show with Mike, either that time or before we went on full time, the extent of the pep talk I got from Mike was, well, let's see what happens. And then there we go. I'm used to like Tom Coughlin giving PowerPoint presentations and everything, and I'm kind of looking for that. But one thing you learn about Mike over time is Mike is extremely well prepared all the time, and there's not necessarily a whole lot of nonsense other than just what goes on the show. We have a really good relationship before the show, after the show. If we have an issue with each other during the show, if we get in an argument during the show, or if one of us, feels like the other one should have done something differently, we're real open about talking about it afterwards. And I think that's helped a lot over the course of 3 years. We've really figured out a way to kind of recognize problems and attack them head on without getting sensitive about it.
Well, that's good advice, because Austin mostly subtweets me in order to help tweak my performance. So I think they take a page out of their book, Austin. But, it's interesting you talk about that. We spend a lot of time thinking about what makes for good content. How do you put together a good show? And I think you guys are our favorite, at least my favorite, certainly. You're articulate, you're amusing, you're on point, you discuss other stuff as well. But we've heard things like you need conflict to have good radio. You got to manufacture arguments and stuff like that. And it doesn't seem like you guys do that. Do you think that conventional wisdom of you have to have fights on air, whether or not you mean them, is just wrong?
Well, here's the thing. I think that a lot of where that comes from is like a first take on ESPN, right? So I don't know if I should criticize them or not, because if I was in a situation where you have 2 or 3 people on a TV show, and there's probably more like immediate preparation, like right before a TV show than a radio show, where the preparation is sort of like more general over the course of the previous, 24 hours. Like TV, you might get in there 2 hours earlier, and you're all probably sitting in a room, and you're like, all right, well, we know what we're going to talk about, what's the angle that we're going to take. And having had a chance to do a decent amount of TV, like with CSN and Houston before, and then some of the different like things I do like once every couple of months, I feel like TV is a format where you feel like this pressure when that red light goes on to like fire off this hot take and like disagree with the person next to you. Where I think radio is just sort of more of a conversation. You're sort of like weaving in and out, and if an argument or a debate happens, then it'll kind of happen. But I don't really feel pressured to ever disagree. Like, if it happens, that's fine. But I'm not gonna I don't want to go in every day and create opinions that I actually don't have and try to defend them over 4 hours.
And that's one thing. It kind of coincides with, you guys probably both know, as you get older, you kind of realize what a pain in the butt is to lie. It is to lie, and you become less of a liar as you get older if you mature in the normal fashion, because you've been burned and pinched too many times. And that's kind of how I am with radio. If I tried to use a lot of contrived takes, you guys know me, I wouldn't be able to keep it straight. I would not be. I would get found out so quickly that I just couldn't handle that tangled web, and I would be found out. So that's at least part of it. And the other thing is that one of the biggest things you have going for you in radio once you're in a market is that the more time you're in that market, the more people are loyal to you, and the more people start to look at you as just part of their daily routine and a part of their life. And I think part of forming that relationship is trying to be as honest with your listeners as possible and trying to come off as much like a real person and as much like yourself as possible. And I mean, my radio persona it's not anything I try for, but it's definitely a more exaggerated version of myself, because you spend 4 hours a day talking and you have to talk. That a lot of those things that you would say, or those emotions that you would kind of squash in normal and polite conversation, they come right out. So it's a more exaggerated version of myself, but at the base of it all, I think when you listen to Mike and I, you're getting pretty much. Mike, I guess that's pretty much the way you and I talk when we're off air. So I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would say like
To each
broadcasting is sort of. Yeah, it's like broadcasting is kind of like an elevated version of yourself, you know. And I'm intrigued by the podcast format because I feel like you can kind of like relax more and like we're doing right now, just kind of chat. Whereas radio, you kind of feel like the in needs to be clean and the out needs to be clean and all these different things. And I suddenly lost my train of thought. But yeah, I mean, but to Seth's point, basically, I mean, I kind of feel I'm running into a lane here. All right, so. I kind of feel I'm doing this podcast while I got this car, and I'm like, this is the first time I'm doing I'm actually doing something into the phone, and it's like the weirdest like cognitive dissonance thing.
That's all right though, Mike. Because yesterday I was listening to Windhorst and Zach Lowe, and Windhorst actually was describing a road rage incident as he was on with Zach Lowe. So if you see anything, be the reporter on the spot. It was good stuff.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And the thing I was going to say is that like if you let's say you saw me at a bar and you went up to me and you were like, hey, like let's talk about like if you asked me my opinion on something or you wanted to give me your opinion. The chances that in that kind of situation, like I'm just like way more low key about things because like when I broadcast and when we do the radio show, I'm like, all right, well I gotta bring it with energy to all this different stuff. But when it comes to like if I was just hanging out with you anywhere, then I'm not gonna like fire up hot takes back and forth and argue with you vehemently. Whereas radio obviously is a different kind of thing.
I think so. When Mike and I, what I meant is when Mike and I are talking to each other off air, we probably because we're not sensitive about it. You know, we know what each other are, and we're probably a little bit more like that. But I don't talk to my wife the way I talk to Mike about AJ Hinch's philosophy on how you should be a closer.
So you guys obviously are very locked in with the text boards and the message boards and the tweeters and the callers and all that stuff. You guys have an idea of the Houston milieu, if you will. So I'm just curious, after this amount of time, being in and amongst the Houston sports fans, is there a defining characteristic to Houston sports or to Houston sports fans? Something because you think like Oakland Raiders fans are violent, crazy people, things like that. Is there a reputation or a characteristic of Houston sports fans?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have as great a feel of that as I should. Like I feel like from a Texan standpoint, I feel like it's there's obviously a ton of passion, and I feel like you can never go wrong talking about the Texans of the NFL because I mean you're in a city that sells out every single game. And no matter what it is, if it's a draft or some event, like you just like see the crowds, or you see the jerseys that are out in the city, and it just speaks to the popularity, the passion. I'll admit, like I have less of a good sense of that when it comes to Rockets fans or Astros fans, just in terms of like demographics. Like obviously people who are big sports fans, casual sports fans. The big sports fan is going to root for all three teams. The casual sports fan, might be in on the Astros and the Rockets or the Texans only when they're winning, one of those kind of situations. But I don't have as great a sense, for example, if you ask me, like, what's the difference between the Astros fan base and the Rockets fan base? I would have a tougher time answering that question. Maybe I should have an easier time. I'm not sure exactly.
You know what?
Fair.
I think it's a trick. It's tricky because the first terms that would spring to mind are maybe long-suffering and beleaguered, but it's tempered by the fact that over the course of the last 20 years since the Rockets won their championships, there haven't been any championships, but there really haven't been a lot of long, awful droughts of losing, except for the Astros when it was by design. And I always feel like there's a little bit of an asterisk there because it's one thing if you're the Cleveland Browns or a team like that has some really bad seasons and they're trying to win. The fact that the Astros went through the period that they did, it's not quite as bad. So if there was one word, I guess I might say frustrated, because there are a lot of diehard, born and bred Houston fans that are getting real antsy to get a championship in one of the three major sports at some point soon.
Now, Seth, I kind of want to dive into your career here for a moment. I mean, you've got a unique background. You had no Division I scholarship offers coming out of college. You went to an Ivy League school, were drafted out of there, spent 10 years in the NFL. How do you think, that experience, that drive, that determination has kind of helped you with that transition to radio in terms of, preparing day to day? Do you take that same mentality of game preparation as you do for, live on air preparation?
Yeah, I do. And I think if there was one thing that I was really lucky to have growing up, and, I didn't have a conventional household necessarily, and my dad is a pretty unique character, but I think both my mom and my dad really instilled in me early on that there was really nothing I couldn't do, and that I should really, whatever dream I might have or whatever I wanted to do in the world, whether it was something big or something unique or something different, that I should just go for it. And, starting at Cornell, where at that point no Ivy League player had been drafted in over a decade, and it wasn't really a realistic career goal for a lot of those guys. Once I decided on what I wanted to do, I didn't really feel like there were any boundaries or limits to it, and I went after it. And the other thing was that because I was raised in a farming family and had to do a lot of really hard, physical, miserable work early on, I think the entire time I was in the NFL, and I think while I'm on radio, I really recognize and understand how lucky you are if you have a job that's really not a job, and that if it's that it's really a game, or it's really playing sports, it's a game and you're doing it for a living. Talking on the radio is something you're going to do with your friends anyway. If you're talking about sports, it's something you're going to do with your friends anyway, but you can get paid to do it. And in recognizing how cool a job that is, that you gotta prepare like it's work. And if you prepare like it's work, then when you're actually performing your job, you can just have fun and always maintain that balance. It's tough sometimes in radio to remember. You have to really remind yourself that sports are supposed to be fun, and you're not supposed to be angry all the time. That's probably the biggest challenge I face day in and day out, and I just always try to remind myself of that.
I think that's a really good point by Seth, especially that last part, because I'm always thinking every day, I'm like, all right, we got 4 hours, we're 6 to 10, what are our main hits? What are the other things we want to mix in? What fun stuff we want to do? And then sometimes, realistically, there are certain times of year, sometimes around now, if, the finals are not that competitive, where you're like, well, we don't really have 4 hours of content, and then you, get internally frustrated. And then sometimes I have to remind myself, okay, we're having fun, we're talking about sports, just think about it in terms of that. Let's just have fun, entertain people, and not worry as much about, do I have enough stuff to, quote-unquote, fill up 4 hours, and just sort of, maybe allow myself to walk that tightrope of, you know what, I'm not convinced I have enough, but let's, go and talk and just kind of, see how it develops.
And what's funny about that, too, is Mike and I are both this way. Sometimes we'll have a segment where we feel like we just phoned it in, we weren't really, we didn't feel like we were saying anything important, and maybe not phoning it in, but it really didn't feel like work, and it was very relaxed. And Mike and I will both feel a little weird about it, and then all of a sudden, on the text line, or my wife will tell me, or the program director will tell me, man, that 6:15 segment was awesome. You guys were just rolling. That was good radio. And it's a reminder that, oh yeah, this is supposed to be fun, and this is supposed to be a couple of guys having a conversation, and if you do that all the time and you're always just chopping it up and not really planning anything out, then again, that probably swings too far the other way. But you got to find that balance.
Talking is exceptionally fun, and no one pays us to do this. This is a passion project, a labor of love. But I got to say, one of the least fun things is being just blindingly, overwhelmingly wrong, which listeners to this podcast know. I've made numerous predictions, and they have almost all been not just wrong, but the polar opposite of what they should be. So, Rockets, I predicted a championship this year before it started. I mean, all kinds of disastrous picks like that. So I'm curious, you guys are on the record with a radio program. Can you remember a most embarrassingly wrong prediction that you're on the record making?
When did I say that we were on the brink of a golden age of Houston sports?
That was a year ago, and I still stand by the overall principle by which you created that opinion.
Why? Why would you do that?
That's how I feel. That's how I feel. But listen, if Osweiler works out and the Rockets can turn it around and the Astros can get better, then we're all in good shape here, right?
Yeah, we're all in good shape, but the Rockets are a 2-year project at least, which puts my prediction 3 years off.
Who knows? It's like a period of time where it needs some time to work out. Who knows? And
that's the other thing. I just said that the Rockets are a 2-year project, which hopefully is a prediction that I'm dead wrong on. Morey's going to work some magic. They're going to trade for somebody. D'Antoni's going to be reborn, and it'll be completely completely different. So hopefully I'm wrong about that too. But that's my biggest one that we have a lot of fun with is that I did say that I thought last season that the Texans were a quarterback away from being from bringing the city of Houston a golden age in Houston sports for all three major professional sports. So what was yours, Mike?
I'm trying to think. I've been wrong on a million different things. For some reason, I can't think of one. I need to find one that I was completely wrong on. But I was for example, I was a relative Matt Schaub defender when he was in Houston. Now I would have never been able to predict obviously the drastic drop off that he had in 2013. You know what's going to happen is we'll finish recording and then and 2 hours later, I'm going to realize something I was completely wrong on. But suffice it to say, I've been wrong on 5 million things. But to me, it kind of comes with the territory because if you read guys like Nate Silver, predicting the future is the hardest thing a human being can do, especially when it comes to sports. So I don't really stress about being wrong. I don't really stress about being wrong about that. I stress about being wrong about maybe you hire the right GM or not. That's more of a fundamental opinion versus is this team going to win a game or not.
And I try really hard. That's one of the other challenges I face is I try really hard to not worry about sounding stupid because that'll be the quickest death you can have in terms of your spontaneity, the energy on your show, humor especially. I finally did learn to I don't worry anymore about whether or not somebody gets my sarcasm or not. If I'm sarcastic on air, I just know that 5% of the people are going to think I'm dead serious and that the Astros have to win this Rangers game or the season's is over, and that's the way it is, and that's just the cost of doing business. So I try real hard not to worry about it. I falter at times, but and I think that goes for playing sports too. If you worry too much about making mistakes, that's when you tease up, that's when you tense up, that's when you choke. So you really got to try to focus on just having a conversation, being, intellectually honest, not just throw stuff out there and hope that it comes true, but not worry too much about whether you end up sounding like an idiot when it doesn't work out.
I actually got a real quick one that I thought about while Seth was talking. Last year, we talked about when should the Astros bring up Carlos Correa, and I had the opinion of well, he broke his ankle the year before, right? And so he hadn't had a lot of at-bats at, I think, AA or AAA. They had just, I think they had just brought him to AAA, and I was listen, this is going to be more of a mid-season, maybe August kind of thing. And I was very conservative with my opinion. And then Correa comes up, and he's just a monster. And I was watching him, and I told the people on Twitter who called me out on it afterwards. I was listen, I'll be honest with you guys. I was completely wrong. I knew this guy had a lot of potential and could be really good. I had no clue that he could be that good right away. I just honestly had no idea and was totally wrong about that.
Just for those that are listening right now, as we are recording, Carlos Correa actually went out of today's Astros game with an apparent injury, so we'll have an update on him later. But both of you guys just mentioned Brock Osweiler and the quarterback situation and Matt Schaub back in the day. But last week on your radio show, you interviewed someone in Denver and kind of spoke about Brock Osweiler and him not attending the White House ceremony. But kind of more broadly looking toward this year, it looks like the Texans have a lot of pieces in place to have a productive offense this year if Osweiler is successful at the quarterback position. What is your take right now on him as a signal caller for the Texans, and do you think he can actually help take this team to that next level?
I right now am trying real hard to be cautiously optimistic. You go back and you watch the games he did play last year, and there were some really bright moments. There were some spots where he looked like a complete field general, and he looked like he knew what he was doing. There are other times where it looked like he struggled to adjust to the defensive adjustments in the second half. And that's what you see out of young quarterbacks. And the real big wild card here is that we saw him in Gary Kubiak's system, which is a completely different system in a lot of respects than what he had been doing the first 3 years he was in the NFL. And to not make any excuses for him or anything, I just don't know. I don't know how much of last year's performance you can translate into what he's going to do with Gary Kubiak's performance. The upside and the thing I've been really excited about is that from just listening to DeAndre Hopkins and talking to people around the Texans organization about his preparation, you can check off all the boxes when it comes to those things that you need in a quarterback in the NFL these days, where he's basically your CEO. Is he demanding of his receivers? Yes. Does he show up first? Does he lead last? Yes. Does he genuinely live, sleep, eat, and breathe football? Yes, and those are all great. That doesn't mean he's going to be a guaranteed success. But at this point in time, that's all you can hope for. The other thing is you can see just by their actions in the draft how much they're committed to helping him work over there. And if you put a bunch of speed on the field, if you have Lamar Miller, who I don't know if Lamar Miller is going to be a bell cow and how many carries he's going to get per game, but he's going to help a quarterback out a lot. Whichever quarterback Lamar Miller plays for, his ability as a receiver is going to help Osweiler out a lot. So I'm optimistic that Osweiler is going to do pretty well, but I'm also really happy to see that whether it was Osweiler, whether it was Mark Sanchez, whoever it would have been that they brought in here, I think the quarterback for the Texans this year is going to have a lot more help and support around him than any of the quarterbacks did last year.
I would agree with the cautious optimism part. I mean, here's the thing. Like, a lot of people that we've seen in the national media have been, maybe not a lot, but a select few have been very critical of the Osweiler signing. And my take is sort of like, I don't know, if you, like, pull back from sports and you look at business, like, one thing that frustrates me sometimes is that people will act like sports teams have unlimited choices and they can, like, go to the grocery store and get whatever they want. It's not really the case. Like, if you look at the Texans situation, we know that they had to make a significant investment in a quarterback this offseason. They've gone 2 years without doing so, and you're selling tickets and you're selling hope. And at some point, when your coach usually has 5 or 6 years in a contract, like, at some point you have to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, we're going to try to have this guy be our franchise quarterback. That's what they started with. If you look at what transpired over the offseason, they did not have the draft capital to move up to number 1 or number 2 without probably literally giving up like J.J. Watt or DeAndre Hopkins. So they couldn't get Carson Wentz or Jared Goff, obviously. And so you were left, if you look like overall in what happened this offseason, it was going to be Brock Osweiler, or it was going to be Paxton Lynch, or one of the other quarterbacks in the draft. And so basically I think what you do as an organization, and I'm sure they did, is you break down the film on all those guys and you say, you know what, our best chance for success in their minds is pay this money to Osweiler, keep the draft picks, use those picks on largely offensive players, and see what you can do. It's not like you were presented with a completely perfect solution. Osweiler, to me, when I saw him play, like Seth mentioned, he looked pretty solid to me. I think that there's upside there. I do worry about the dynamic of, I've always had the opinion that in football, in the NFL, if you're completely desperate for someone to stay, then you're going to find a way for that guy to stay. And the Broncos felt like they couldn't move past a certain point with Osweiler, so that scares me based on how good of a GM John Elway has been. But I will agree with the overall sense of cautiously optimistic.
You guys know, I think we all know, this is a pro sports town. Obviously, you have 3 major sports here. We're blessed to have that kind of a presence here in Houston. But I'm a U of H alum, and so I'm always looking for U of H to sort of climb that ladder and be part of the conversation. And so I'm just, from your perspective, doing these shows and so forth, obviously Tom Herman's come in. They had a great deal of success last year, beat Florida State in the Peach Bowl. What would it take for this to be a really vibrant college town that is invested in U of H and maybe not so much in like the Texas or the Texas A&M?
Mike and I actually just had a small conversation about, college football in general after our show today, and looking ahead, wondering if we should talk more college football this year, because we were looking at some of the TV numbers from last year, and the University of Houston in particular, you guys know, did very well on television, and we're trying to kind of figure out and gauge exactly how much college football we can talk. The tricky thing with college football on our show or on radio, I think in general, is that as soon as you start talking Texas A&M, then there's a whole portion of the audience that doesn't want to hear anything about A&M. As soon as you start talking about Houston, there's a whole portion of the audience that only wants to hear SEC. So it's a matter of finding that right balance. And obviously with Houston and Tom Herman and everything that happened this last year, there's a whole lot of pent-up and potential emotion there, and there are a whole lot of people that want to watch it on television. I think this year, for us personally, we're probably going to end up focusing a lot more on University of Houston, on some local college. I just don't know. I don't really have a feel for it yet, how exactly that's going to look.
Yeah, one of the hardest things for us is just in terms of like the programming structure, and that it's obviously, as you guys mentioned, a pro sports town, so it's an NFL city. In the fall, your Monday is going to be basically, you're going to take whatever the Texans game on Sunday, and that's going to be the major conversation over the course of those 4 hours, and you'll like mix in the other big NFL games and stories of the weekend. And so really the first time you can talk about college football, at least in detail, will be Tuesday. And then you kind of feel like, well, you're a few days separate from the games, and it's a lot more natural sometimes to talk about a game the moment or the day after it happened. Whereas for us, it's like, all right, you've got a Texans game Sunday, and so you're going to do a lot of that on Monday, and you have to like save all the college football stuff for Tuesday. That it kind of makes it like more difficult for us from just a pure structural standpoint, but not really an excuse. I mean, that's something that I need to personally be better at.
But this is the thing too. Tom Herman's personality and the force of his personality is just a phenomenon unto itself. And I think he did some things with Houston this year, not just on the field, but in terms of the perception of the University of Houston within the city that really took a lot of people by surprise. And we did a broadcast from just off campus down there this year, and then I drove. Mike and I have both been on campus for various reasons a lot more this last year. And the one thing that really struck me when I was down there is, man, you see all that red, and when you see the team mentioned in national conversations and in the rankings, you get that. I didn't go to University of Houston. I've never, I have no connection. I didn't date a girl that went to University of Houston. But the fact that it says Houston on the sign, and you know that they're doing well, and it's the local football team, I started to kind of feel a sense of pride about it, and you get excited, and you get that collegiate feel about things. So I don't know where it's going to go from here, and I think the bigger question is, no matter how long Tom Herman sticks around, can he establish something there that is a legacy, and that, whether it's Major Applewhite or somebody else, whoever ends up being the coach whenever Tom Herman leaves, can they keep going what he's created right there? Because a lot of it isn't just the success on the field. It's Tom Herman's really outsized personality, and then I say outsized in a good way.
Speaking of cult of personality, Seth, obviously you were a professional athlete, a radio orator, and you've got, I'm looking at Deceptively Fast here, which is that a blog effort that you've put together here?
Yeah.
Are there going to be more of these in the future? Because I'm pleasantly, I shouldn't say pleasantly surprised. It's actually a lot like Deceptively Fast in terms of a backhanded compliment. But I am surprised. I mean, it's enjoyable writing. I like reading the stuff that you've written. Is there going to be more of that coming forward?
I think once every 2 or 3 months, I decide that I'm going to start writing more, and I do it, and it's just, I'll tell you this, I've got no self-confidence when it comes to my writing, and I'm not a perfectionist in any other realm of life, but when I've never written a single thing in my life that I'm happy about, so it's kind of one of those things where it's an exercise in just trying to stream of consciousness, put it out there, edit it up a little bit, and put it on the internet without really thinking about it. So I can't really give you a straight answer. Yeah, deceptivelyfast.com. I have some fun with that. The program director at our station would much more like me to go to sportsradio610.com and write a lot more there. So hopefully there will be more on that in the future.
I actually have to tell Kevin that when we send out social media tweets on Monday to make sure that he tweets it from the show account rather than his personal account first. But guys, we've really enjoyed the conversation and appreciate you guys taking the time out to talk with us on the Weekly Brew podcast this week. And again, for our listeners, we've got Mike Meltser and Seth Payne from MaD Radio on the podcast this week. And if you want to tune into them, you can find them on Sports Radio 610 in Houston from 6 to 10 a.m. on your morning drive. And guys, you are pretty active on social media, both of you. How can our listeners, find you, and what is the best way for them to connect to you?
So basically, Twitter or Facebook. Twitter is at Mike Meltser, real simple. It's with an S, not a Z. And Facebook, Mike Meltser as well. And I am relatively active on both, I think, although probably more active on Twitter when it comes to people and listeners wanting to chat about different things.
I am on Twitter at Payne NFL. Facebook, you can find me at Deceptively Fast, and then also, obviously, deceptivelyfast.com.
To our listeners out there, make sure that you follow them on all of their social media platforms. They produce great content. And also, we encourage you to listen to their morning drive show on Sports Radio 610 if you don't already. But Mike, Seth, we definitely appreciate you guys joining us this week.
Guys, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime. Thanks, guys.